Yeah.
This is Geek Therapy Radio.
What are we waiting for?
And now your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger.
So this morning, Sarah was brushing her teeth and we were in a hurry. And we have our Amazon Echo, I won't say her name, Alexa, hooked up to a smart plug. And it goes to the sound system, and the name of that smart plug is speakers. So if you tell her to turn the speakers off, it turns the whole home theater off, basically. But Sarah was brushing her teeth, so it was muffled, and she was asking her to turn the speakers off. So when she said, "Alexa, turn your speakers off," this is what Alexa came back with.
Shake It Off by Taylor Swift on Amazon Music.
Oh yeah.
That's what people say. Tell me some dates. I just say to you. That's what people say. That's what people say. Okay. Woohoo! Play, and the haters gonna hate, and the haters gonna say, shake it off, woohoo!
Will I play the whole song? Probably not.
And the haters gonna say, and the haters gonna say, shake it off.
Please don't turn the station. Please don't turn the station. I just had to do that for my wife because it'll annoy her very much. Alexa, stop, for the love of God. Sometimes she disobeys me. Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio. This is not TRL, even though, man, you know what's sick to think about? Not sick to think about, what is kind of terrible to think about is that, was Taylor Swift even alive when TRL was a thing with Carson Daly? And we were watching the top 10 music videos of the day. It was like Blink-182 and NSYNC and Backstreet Boys and Eminem and all of them. How old was Tay-Tay? Tay-Tay was probably 4 years old, if that. Isn't that sad to think about? Am I too old? Are we too old? Regardless, welcome into Geek Therapy Radio. There has been so much that has gone on this week. So many things in tech news mainly, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that. I want to definitely dive into Buzz Aldrin's view of the future for NASA. He says that he's got it figured out. Buzz Aldrin is 89 years old, almost 90. He's around 90 years old, and he's still there. He still has good ideas. He's still punching out moon landing conspiracy theorist. He is an old buck. He still has lots of good ideas, and I want to dive into his ideas for deep space exploration because they are not crazy. They are actually good ideas, and top scientists are actually saying, like, yeah, that is not so far-fetched. That is doable. There's some technology we need to invent along the way, or to perfect, I should say, along the way, that will get us to deep space exploration, but it is very, very doable. By the way, I am recording in my apartment. In our apartment, Sarah is gone for the weekend. She's doing a poverty simulation because she is an absolute saint. I miss her very much, but I am recording the show in the apartment tonight. It's just me and the cats. One of the cats, Jack, the, I'll just say special needs cat, has not strayed very far away from the front door. He keeps expecting her to walk through it, which is kind of sad. You might hear from Jack later in the episode. But I want to cover some quick tech news, since a lot happened in tech this week, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time with it in the rest of the show. So let's talk about tech for a few minutes. First and foremost, of course, being that Nintendo announced this week the new Nintendo Switch Lite, which I am very excited about. I did my past Midweek Geek all about it. I've got a video uploading about it to YouTube as I'm recording this right now. I'm multitasking. So if you want to hear my thoughts on the Nintendo Switch Lite in full detail, listen to the last episode of Midweek Geek. It's the podcast right before this podcast. And go to the Geek Therapy Radio YouTube channel and subscribe to it and check out the video I have on it. Basically, the video is asking if the Nintendo Switch Lite is even right for you. There's so many videos that come out that say, is the Nintendo Switch Lite worth it? Is the iPad worth it? Is the Mac Pro worth it? Is your daddy worth it? So I'm begging the question that I don't see many other people asking. Screw worth. Worth is all relative. Is this thing even right for you in the first place? So, yeah, that's big news this week. Nintendo has announced the Nintendo Switch Lite. In brief, the controls are all built in. There's no detachable Joy-Cons. There's no kickstand. There's no different sensors and whatnot. It's a very stripped down version of the Nintendo Switch that doesn't switch at all. So why they even call it the Nintendo Switch is beyond me. It's not switching from portable to console mode anymore. It's just one handheld thing designed specifically for portability. Let's move on to something else real quick. So the next biggest news of the week is that Apple has officially killed the MacBook, not the MacBook Pro or the MacBook Air, but that little tiny MacBook. They've at least killed it off for now. You can only buy brand new MacBook Airs and MacBook Pros, and they've gotten rid of half the MacBook Pros. You can only get MacBook Pros now with that stupid Touch Bar. But prices have come down. There have been improvements made. It's just now your only options for MacBooks are the MacBook Air and MacBook Pro, both of which have been improved, but they've eliminated the function key version of the MacBook Pro. I don't even want to speculate too much as to why Apple's doing that. You know what I want to talk about in the next segment, though? Let's talk about the Raspberry Pi 4. Let's talk about who is it for. Get it? Raspberry Pi 4, who's it for? Wow, we're off to a flying start with this first segment. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. I am your mental curator, showing you around this wacky mental museum of mind. We're all geeks about something. Lean into your inner geek. Geeks are sexy. Geeks are beautiful, which by default means you're sexy and beautiful. So stick around. There's plenty more Geek Therapy Radio to come. We're going to talk about space. We're going to talk about Raspberry Pis. It's going to be fun. Don't go anywhere. Let's talk about not just the Raspberry Pi 4, but the Raspberry Pi computers in general in this segment, this 10-minute segment. I'm going to save the segment 3, the 11-minute segment, for our space chat to talk about Buzz Aldrin's plan to go into deep space for human to further space exploration. The Raspberry Pi 4, let's start there. That's Raspberry's latest release. Raspberry, by the way, is a operation out of the UK that builds very, very inexpensive computers. They call them, well, some of them desktop replacements. Are they desktop replacements? Is the Raspberry Pi 4 a desktop replacement really now? But they built, for instance, the Raspberry Pi 4, the most expensive version of it, the 4 gigabyte version of it, costs $55. The cheapest Raspberry Pi is the Raspberry Pi Zero, and it costs $5. It's an entire computer. All you need to do is supply your own micro SD card and a couple of dongles that you probably have laying around the house already, and it's a fully functioning computer. There's so much more that goes into Raspberry Pi. It's for tinkerers. If you love to tinker with not just computers, but machinery and AI and automation especially, basically the Raspberry Pi computer in any configuration, any model of the Raspberry Pi computer allows you to build devices and build automation and build projects that are just limited by your imagination. Since you can buy these computers for so cheap, let's say you do something and you accidentally fry a Raspberry Pi Zero. You're out $5. You're not out a $1,000 PC. That being said, of course, a Raspberry Pi Zero, for instance, is not going to have, or a Pi 4 Pi 4, for instance, isn't going to have nearly the power of a $1,000 computer. Of course not. The most expensive Pi, like I said, cost $55. But what I mean by limited by your imagination is you can quite literally automate your entire house, including having a surveillance camera and all that stuff, with a Pi Zero. So to give you a sense of scale for the different models of Pi, we'll start with the Zero. The Pi Zero that costs $5 is a single core processor. So the processor in there, it's like 1.2 gigahertz. Maybe it's even less than that. Maybe it's 900 megahertz. But it's a single core, so that means it's good for things like automation. You can put a headless operating system on it. Headless just means there's no desktop. So you can have an operating system on there that you can remote access from a PC elsewhere to put in your code or put in your programs, but it's not wasting space or processing power with a GUI, with a graphical user interface. So you can have a Pi Zero, for instance, running the automation of your home, your lights, cameras around your house, recording, and you can have these images and videos uploaded to your cloud so you can monitor it anywhere you are in the world. It's kind of a really fancy way to set up a Nest system instead of spending hundreds of dollars on a Nest, on a all-in-one home automation system or home security system. If you are inclined enough and you have the capability or are willing to learn, you can do it yourself with the Raspberry Pi, all the way down to a $5 Raspberry Pi Zero. And I know a lot of you who might be listening right now who have Pis and are tinkering with Pis, you know that I'm not even scratching the surface with what you can do with this. And the key phrase I haven't mentioned here yet is that the entire model that Raspberry Pi is built on, the entire company's modus operandi, is that all of this is open source. So the operating system you download, it's based on Linux and it's free. It's called Raspbian. It's Debian Stretch. What is it up to now? It's a free operating system, and it comes with LibreOffice, which is a free version of Microsoft Office. So you have fully compatible versions of Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel and PowerPoint. It's all included. It's all for free, and the files are intercompatible with actual Microsoft Office. But you get it for free. You can download this operating system for free, and that operating system will even work on your x86 computer as usual. Not just your Raspberry Pi, which is based on ARM processors. So back to the Pi Zero, it's a single core computer. It comes with, I want to say, 256 megabytes of RAM. That's it. But you'll be surprised with what you can actually do with 256 megabytes of RAM. I will say at the Pi Zero, it's terrible for video. Do not torture yourself trying to go onto YouTube with a Raspberry Pi Zero. But doing things like word processing and basic kind of desktop operations, it's great for that. It can browse the internet using Chromium. It's slow, but it's no slower than a 486 from the 90s. So those of us who are used to slower computers, this is still fast compared to those computers. It's still very usable. And that is the $5 version of the Raspberry Pi Zero. So let's skip ahead. The most recent before the Raspberry Pi 4 was the Raspberry Pi 3 in the B+, which are just basically different variants of the same computer. So I don't have a Pi 4 in my possession. I do have a Raspberry Pi 3 B+, which has a gig of RAM, right? Is that it? A gig of RAM? 512 megabytes of RAM? Maybe that's it. Either way, for such a lightweight operating system that I'm running on it, Raspbian and RetroPie, we haven't even talked about RetroPie yet. I'll bring that up in a moment. That's what I think is going to be the coolest thing for most people. But 512 megabytes of RAM at least, it's very serviceable, and it's a quad-core processor. Once you get into the Raspberry Pi 3 and 4, it's a quad-core ARM processor, and that actually has a little bit of substance to it. Opening things doesn't take forever. It's rather instant, depending on what type of storage media you're using. By default, you can use a micro SD card, which you can find laying around for free, or go buy for $1.50 for like an 8 gigabyte micro SD card. If you can avoid it, though, I would recommend putting your operating system on a USB stick rather than an SD card, a micro SD card, because micro SD cards are not optimized for the quick read and write cycles and the 4K read and write cycles, that very fast kind of transient reading and writing of the little tiny little files. Micro SD cards not good for that, and that's why they're so slow to run an operating system off of, and it's also putting a lot of stress on the micro SD card, so I wouldn't rely on it. You can use over USB 2.0 with the Raspberry Pi 3, you can use an external hard disk, an external solid state drive, and that is much faster way to run an operating system. With the Raspberry Pi 4, the interface is now upgraded to USB 3.0, and the USB-C connection is just for power. There's no data going over that. But the protocol for USB is upgraded to USB 3.0, and you actually get full gigabit Ethernet. And again, this is a computer that starts at $35 for the 1 gigabyte model, is $45 for the 2 gigabyte of RAM model, and $55 for the 4 gigabyte of RAM model. And that is finally DDR4 RAM. It's the latest version of RAM that all main computers use. And I think it's running at 266 megahertz, which ain't too shabby. The processor is beefed up a little bit. It's more efficient. It's a higher ARM processor. It's still a very cheap processor. It's not powerful at all. But still, that USB 3.0 protocol makes this thing up to 4 times faster than the last Raspberry Pi 4, which makes it much better for emulation. And that's what RetroPie is, like I mentioned earlier. I have RetroPie on an SD card, which the beauty of this is I can take it out of my Pi 0 and put it into my Pi 3 or 4, and it runs the same. It's just taken advantage of the better RAM and more CPU power. So RetroPie, I'm able to play all of my Game Boy games and NES games and 8-bit and some 16-bit games on this little single-core $5 computer hooked up to my TV with a Bluetooth controller. It's freaking amazing. I love Raspberry Pi, and I haven't even scratched the surface of all the things you can do with this. It's like it's a sandbox for nerds. If you're a programmer, if you program in Python or in Basic, and well, not necessarily, but yeah, Basic, in C++, whatever you're programming in, get a Pi. And if you're a programmer, you probably already know about it, so it's a moot point telling you to go get a Pi. You know what? In the next segment, let's talk about deep space travel. If there's one thing that I know a lot of geeks can relate to, and remember, we're all geeks about something. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio, by the way, if you're just tuning in on the radio dial and have no idea what you're listening to. I am Johnny Hemberger, your mental curator, right here on Geek Therapy Radio, where we are all geeks about something. It can be muscle cars, it can be bodybuilding, it can be remote control airplanes, it can be trains, it can be computers or astronomy or medicine or anything. Video games. We are all geeks about something, and geeks are sexy. So, one of the things that has kept my geek brain from getting a lot of sleep some nights is space travel. I know that a lot of you out there who are geeks, we have lost sleep over many, many things. Our mind just wanders. It's not a paranoia thing. It's not an anxiety thing. It's not necessarily a insomnia thing. I mean, I guess it can be sometimes, but it's just that our brains get off on this tangent, and we stare at the ceiling in the dark, stare at the fan blades, and we just think this through for hours upon hours. And one of the things I have spent so much time losing sleep over has been space travel. In particular, one aspect of space travel I've thought of is how do we get from the Earth to Mars? And one thing I've deduced, which it's very common, and I agree with, is that we have to set up a base on the moon. The path to Mars starts with a moon base, and really even before it starts with a moon base, it starts with a more efficient means of getting supplies and cargo to and from the moon to set up shop, to have as a base to then go to Mars from. So that's a very kind of roundabout way of saying one of the things that I've envisioned, that I've stayed up at night late thinking of, that when I can't sleep, is this more efficient delivery system. So let's stay with the moon. Let's keep it at the moon for now, because this can also apply to Mars. But an efficient delivery system in between the moon and Earth is not a space elevator. That's prohibitively expensive, and the physics, the logistics of that is just, we don't have a substance strong enough, not even carbon nanotubes, that could make a structure strong enough that we know of to actually tether an elevator between the Earth and the moon. So that's kind of out of the question, at least for the foreseeable future. What's not out of the question is using spacecraft, or available spacecraft, or spacecraft we can build in the future, in the very near future. So let me paint this picture of what I'm thinking of. It involves orbit. We send up a craft that is in a very elliptical orbit around the moon and the Earth. Or you can alter its orbit, that it kind of stays around Earth orbit, and then you can send it off to around moon orbit. Actually, no, take that back. Strike that from the record. Strike it. We're speculating now together onto how this is going to work. You have an elliptical orbit, a very stretched elliptical orbit around the Earth and the moon. So, as this thing continues to orbit around the Earth and the moon, at one point in its orbit, it's very close to the Earth. At the furthest end of its orbit, it's way closer to the moon, and it comes back around, it's way close to Earth, and it swings back around, and it's way close to the moon. That's its orbit. So what we can do is, while that is just in a pretty much permanent orbit in that fashion, where a few days out of the month it's close to the moon, a few days out of the month it's close to the Earth, and vice versa. Basically, we wait for it to swing around in its orbit close to Earth. We send up a delivery vehicle to pass off the payload to this different vehicle that's already in this elliptical orbit. So it carries it under its own momentum, mostly, even though adding mass to it, you're going to have to adjust for that a bit, but it carries it under its own momentum back to the moon, where it can drop it off from that vehicle that's, while it's close to the moon, down to the surface of the moon, and the delivery vehicle continues on its way back in its orbit, back towards close orbit to Earth, and it just keeps doing this circle, this elliptical orbit, basically, that we rendezvous with it in its closest orbit to Earth to make its delivery to the moon, and it comes back, we rendezvous with it again to take another package on its orbit back to the moon. You kind of see what I'm saying here? A very long, elliptical, stretched out circle orbit around the Earth and the moon. And we have a vehicle that either attaches to it and hitches a ride to the moon, where it's dropped off again to go down to the moon to deliver supplies. It leaves the lunar surface again, reattaches to this basically endless escalator going around the Earth and the moon. And this, I'm saying all that because Buzz Aldrin has also thought about this. Now, granted, I won't go into too much detail because there just isn't enough time in at least one broadcast to go into it. But Buzz Aldrin has come up with a very similar idea for a delivery system to the moon and the Mars. It's basically to have vehicles in low Earth orbit and high Earth orbit, and these elliptical orbits between the Earth and the moon that we can kind of trade off supplies. It's called the Cislunar 1000. I believe that's what it's called, what his plan is called, and his isn't the first plan of this nature. There have been other scientists who have developed similar plans, and that's kind of the key point here, is many scientists separately have come up with a similar plan to each other. So that means when you have a bunch of scientists separately coming up with plans that wind up being in agreement with each other, that usually means you're on the right track. And that usually means you can take those scientists credibly, because they're doing their own separate research, they're doing their own separate experiments, and they're all coming basically to the same conclusion, that this plan that Buzz Aldrin has, and that yours truly has speculated, and many other people have speculated, is viable. And it's actually fiscally viable. Right now, so the reason why Buzz Aldrin came up with this plan and started really pushing it, and he's very passionate about this, is he is so frustrated with the lack of progress by NASA in the past 50 years, since we're coming up to the anniversary of the moon landing. Aldrin, who never stood foot on the moon, he piloted the command module, basically, while the others went down to the moon. He says this is his last chance, not only in his life because he's getting old, but we only celebrate a 50th anniversary of the moon landing once. So while the hype train and all the spotlights are on the Apollo program, and Apollo 11 specifically, the first mission to land a man on the moon, he's using it as a vehicle to promote this plan to get NASA moving again, really in earnest with space exploration. And he saw one of the major drawbacks is that, yes, the Saturn V rocket worked for a program like Apollo, but the Saturn V rocket and the new SLS rocket, which is not as powerful as the Saturn V rocket. To date, the Saturn V rocket is still the most powerful machine that human beings have ever built. But machines like the SLS rocket they're inefficient, and they're extremely expensive. And that's what we would have to rely on to take astronauts and take gear to the moon and the Mars, to the moon and Mars. And that is just a very inefficient way to do it. And he says that the reason why NASA is so bogged down is because they are doing things so inefficiently. It's hard to get Congress and the general public, the taxpayer, behind the idea to do this deep space exploration, because as of now, it is prohibitively expensive. Also, part of Buzz Aldrin's plan, and many others' plans, is to not only commercialize space as far as doing experiments for private companies and everything like that. We've been doing that. But to really get space tourism going in earnest. One of Aldrin's ideas, and it's even the Trump administration's idea, is we got the International Space Station up there. It's coming to the end of its life soon. Why don't we recommission it and kind of reconfigure it to be partly commercial experimentation and partly space tourism? If you charge rich people $1 million per ticket or $500,000 per ticket so that they can go stay in a space hotel and snap a selfie in space, a $500,000 selfie in space, you know people would pay for that. You know rich people would do that, and that would help to fund things like deep space exploration. Buzz Aldrin really wants NASA to be on top of this because he doesn't want companies like SpaceX to get there first. He's not morally against SpaceX getting there first. He just thinks it's a shame that NASA doesn't get there first, when NASA is the agency that spearheaded all of this. So I'm with Buzz Aldrin in all of this. I'm with his plan for these low Earth orbit, kind of elliptical orbits around the moon and the Earth in a more efficient way to do things, because that's how we get to deep space. I could talk about this for hours. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I am your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. Let's talk about cars. Let's at least talk about cars in this final segment, because as some of you might know, my car is in the shop. Actually, I have to pick it up tomorrow. The starter finally went out at 138,000 miles or so. And the thing is that in my car, it is prohibitively expensive to change to put in a new starter. Usually starters for car guys, for any car guys or gals out there, you know that replacing a starter isn't necessarily a difficult job. You can do that on a Saturday morning. Not with my car. And for full disclosure, my car is a 2010, so almost 10 years old, Audi S5. It's one of the last naturally aspirated V8 Audis ever made. German sports cars ever made. It's finding, with a 6-speed manual transmission, it is getting tougher and tougher and tougher to find a V8 coupe, naturally aspirated V8 coupe with a manual transmission. It is a dying breed, and I am sad, so sad, that just by cost, it's on its last legs. To change the starter in that car, you have to basically drop the engine. They have crammed the starter way up underneath there. You have to drop the subframe. You have to disassemble the whole front end. It was all in an effort to make that 4.2 V8, which is a peach of an engine. It is amazing, and it's still running strong, and it's worldwide regarded as one of the best engines of all time. But the starter in the latest version of that 4.2 V8 is crammed way up in there for the sake of making the engine all the more compact. And anytime they try to make big engines more compact, that just means it's going to be a mechanic's nightmare, and it's not going to be cheap to do even a wear and tear item like the starter. The starter is a wear and tear item. Normally, in any normal car, to replace a starter, a couple $100, $500 maybe. Maybe on average around $500. You want to know how much I was quoted for my car to change the starter? About $3,500. $3,500. Which, no, I'm not doing that. I am not doing that. And that's what I'm getting around to saying. And they're like, you know what? You haven't changed the clutch either. Even though the clutch is grabbing good, the clutch is fine. There's not any play in the clutch. In the clutch travel, it's still engaging just fine. It's not engaging way at the top end of the clutch movement. The clutch is fine. There's no slippage, nothing. But they said, once we get in there to get the starter out and everything's pulled apart and the engine's dropped, it would be silly not to replace the clutch, and that's an additional about $2,500 to $3,000. It's a big clutch. You have to take so many things apart. So basically, I was staring down the barrel of at least $5,000 to take care of everything, not counting the electrical anomalies they detected in their codes, which is probably caused by a short somewhere due to a coolant leak. So the coolant leak was going to be relatively cheap to fix, a few $100 to fix that. But they said it might have damaged some cables, it might have caused a short, or it may not have. They said all these issues could be just some electrical gremlin somewhere. But they said if it's a simple electrical gremlin, then I would still be in it for a lot of labor hours to find the electrical gremlin. What if it is a 50-cent fuse somewhere, but they don't find it for 20 labor hours? The point is, Rowdy is done. She still has a strong heart, strong drivetrain, but she won't start because that starter, which is cheap, the starter itself is a couple $100, but to get to it and replace it is prohibitively expensive. So, needless to say, I said, don't do anything more. I'll pay you for whatever services so far, your exploration, but don't do anything. I'm just going to try to sell it to see what I can get for it. So that has me thinking about cars now. So the cars I've been looking at, the two front runners are, I really want an EV. So the front runner now, before Volkswagen really starts pushing EVs in 2020 with the ID line, they have a Volkswagen e-Golf, which gets about 100 miles of range, which ain't too shabby. And again, you have to think about EVs like you think about your smartphone. Stop thinking about it like you're trying to find a gas station. Think about it like your smartphone that you just plug in every day. That when you get home, you just plug it in. Just like when you go to bed, you plug in your smartphone. When you go to bed, plug in your car. And it's always got a full tank. Your EV always has a full tank if you start thinking about it like any random device you would normally charge. Just charge it like any other device you already have. So anyways, I'm looking at the Volkswagen e-Golf because it's cheap. It's cheap enough. And if I don't get that, the next cheapest option, it would be a Volkswagen Golf Sport Wagon or Jetta Sport Wagon, depending on the year. TDI, yes, diesel. Yes, diesel. 50 plus miles to the gallon. You bet I'm looking at that. I had a diesel before Dieselgate. I had a diesel and it was absolutely wonderful. It was not affected by Dieselgate. The cars that you can still buy for dirt cheap that are TDIs, you can still buy relatively new, 2015, that's when Volkswagen got nailed for this, TDIs that have gotten the services done to it, have gotten the software upgrades that they're now compliant. They don't piss off California emissions anymore to set off any alarm bells. They are fully compliant now, and you can get them for dirt cheap, and they get 50 miles to the gallon. That, you know what? That whole thing reeked of, I don't want to say the conspiracy word, but conspiracy. What interest do oil companies have in cars running around that the owners rarely ever have to buy their product? If you're getting 50 miles to the gallon versus 25 miles to the gallon, do you think the oil companies want you in the 50 mile per gallon car? I don't think so. So I'm not saying there definitely was a conspiracy there. I'm just saying it was not in the oil company's best interests to have Volkswagen TDIs running around getting 50 or 60 miles to the gallon on the highway. It just wasn't going to work for the business model of selling petroleum. I'm just saying there's some coincidence there. Not that that's what happened. I fully believe, yes, there's too many noxious gases coming out the tailpipe to... Basically what these noxious gases do is it irritates people with asthma. Or that's what they claim. Really? Was there enough going out, all things considered, to really bother anybody? It all sounds so shady, and Volkswagen wasn't the only one doing it. They were just the biggest company in the world other than Toyota, so they got nabbed. You're not going to go after Fiat for cheating on emissions. You're going to go after Volkswagen. So a lot of manufacturers have been nailed for the emissions. It's just Volkswagen was the biggest and they got the most money, and it's a whole thing. Anyways, so I'm looking at cars. And one thing I got to thinking, since I know that I do have a few people listening to this that are Volkswagen fans, what's up? Thinking of what a shame it was that, yes, Volkswagen still sells the Alltrack and the Sport Wagon, which are station wagons. They're compact station wagons. They are perfect cars. They get amazing gas mileage, and it fits everything, if not more so, than a traditional SUV while getting 40 miles to the gallon. It's great. So why aren't they more popular? I think it's a shame that Volkswagen never made an R version, like a Golf R, that has 300 some odd horsepower and all-wheel drive. They never made an R version or a GTI version of the Golf Sport Wagon. So basically a GTI or R version of a station wagon. That would have been amazing. And when I say station wagon, it doesn't mean the wheelbase is any longer than a traditional Golf or Jetta. It just means that it has an extra storage space behind the back seats. You know what station wagons look like. Now think of one that'll do 0 to 60 in 4 seconds and still get 35 miles to the gallon. Volkswagen, please give us Sport Wagon Rs or GTI Sport Wagons. That would be so perfect. That'd be so perfect. That'd be so cool. I talked about Volkswagens and cars for a lot in this segment. We talked about space. We talked about Raspberry Pi. I got my Tay-Tay on in the first segment. What a weird show it's been. Say goodbye, Jack. He's passed out. Anyways, thanks for staying with me. Be good to each other and yourselves, and I'll see you next week.